this story came into my heart this morning, and it came into my heart because of the idea of bucket and filling a bucket with stories. And there's a story it's called The Tale Teller, and it's from one of the collections that Allison Cox had pulled
Oh,
together
nice.
and curated for her the healing. This one was from the Healing Stories for Communities, and it's by Leslie Slape, and I'm telling a slightly adapted version. And I'm actually going to move this off my thanks for your patience as I'm at an Airbnb, so I'm making the best of what I've got here. Awesome. All right. When the tale teller came to town, the word spread quickly. And the people would arrive from the north and the south and the east and the west, and they would gather. And the people would be so excited that when the teller arrived, it would be declared a feast day. No work need to be done, and the great hall would be open, and a feast would be laid out. And everyone would gather round, and the tale teller would arrive, stride to the front of that room, pull off the leather satchel, set it on the table, reach in and pull out a precious stone. And the people would call out, "Story, story, tell us a story." And the teller would nod, take that stone, press it to their heart, close their eyes, take a breath, and begin. Once upon a time, there was a father with 3 sons, and the teller would spin a tale, and the audience would be enraptured by the words. They would lean in and whisper among each other, "Did you hear? Did you hear?" And when the teller was finished, would place that precious stone back in the bag, and of course the people would cry out, "Another, another, tell another, this time a funny one." And the teller would reach into that leather satchel. This time the stone was bright red. And once again, the teller would hold it to their heart, close their eyes, take a breath. Once upon a time, there was a bear and a fox. They lived in the woods. And the teller spun a story so funny the people laughed, tears streaming down their faces, and they would cry out, "Another, another, tell another. This time, tell a love story." And the teller would reach into the leather satchel and this time pulled out a golden stone in the shape of a teardrop. And once again held it to the heart, closed eyes, took a breath. Once upon a time, there were 2 lovers. Oh, their lives were filled with trials and tribulations. And the teller wove that story, and the people listened. Now, it just so happened there was one person who was not listening. There was a young man who was more interested in all the food laid out on those tables and hadn't paid any attention to the stories, but oh, did notice those precious stones in that sack. And that thief was just waiting for just the right moment. And then it occurred. "Ah, my friends, I've told you stories, and now I must slake my thirst." And the teller went off to go get a drink, and the thief slithered on up to that table, glanced around the room. Was anyone looking? Ah, no. Reached right in and grabbed a handful of those precious stones, stuffed them into his leather pouch, and lickety split slithered out of that room. And that thief went right to the jeweler's house, knocked on the jeweler's door. Jeweler opened it. "What could you want at this time of night?" "Oh, my friend, it is worth your time, even at this time of night. I have with me some precious jewels for you. Just look." And with that, the thief reached into the leather pouch and put out his hand. The jeweler looked down and said, "It's just an ordinary stone, like you'd find at the side of the road. Why do you bother me with this?" The thief looked into his hand and it was true. It wasn't a precious stone. It was just a rock. He threw it down to the ground and then took that leather pouch and just dumped it out. And he couldn't believe it. They were just rocks. And the jeweler began to laugh. Oh, these are from the teller, aren't they? You were just over in the great hall, were you not? The thief was surprised. Yes, how did you know? Oh, these are just ordinary rocks, unless the stories are contained within them. Did you bother to listen? And the thief shook his head. Without the stories, these stones are worthless. Be gone with you. Well, my friends, meanwhile, back at the hall, that teller had made their way back to the front of the room and was just about to tell another story. And through the audience, the murmurings could be heard, story, story, another story. And that's when the teller saw her, a peasant girl, with such sadness in her eyes filled with as much sadness as her skirts were filled with the food that she had gathered. And the tale teller knew exactly the story to tell for that girl. And the teller reached into that bag and pulled out a stone of silver, held it to their heart, closed the eyes, and began. Once upon a time, there was a poor peasant girl, and her sister was so very sick. They lived in a certain time in a certain place, and the teller wove a story of hope. And that poor peasant girl, she walked closer and closer to where the teller was telling until she was standing right in front of him. And when the teller was finished with the story, please, please, could you come to my home and share that story with my sister? She is very sick, just like you said. That story would help her. And the teller reached out with that stone and said, my dear, take this stone and you tell the story to your sister. I'll do the best I can. She took that stone wrapped in her hand ever so carefully. With all that food wrapped in her skirt, she made her way back home. And when she opened the door, there was her sister, still sick, in bed, as she had been for weeks. And the sister with the stone, she sat next to her sick sister and she held that stone to her heart, just like she saw the teller do, and closed her eyes and took a breath. And she began. Once upon a time, there was a poor peasant girl, and her sister was sick. It was a certain time and a certain place, and she wove that story. And the words, they were not all perfect, and some of them were missing. But she told as much as she could remember, and she told from her heart. And her sister, who'd been so sick, for the first time in weeks, there was a little color in her cheeks, and she sat up just a bit with that pillow behind her, and she spoke. Tell it again. Tell it again. The sister held that stone to her heart, closed her eyes, took a breath, and this time the words, more of them were there. She began, once upon a time, there was a poor peasant girl and her sister who was sick, and they lived in a certain time in a certain place, and the words, they just flowed out. And when she was finished, her sister was sitting up tall in the bed. She said, oh, tell it again, tell it again. This is better than food. Once again, the sister placed that stone against her heart, closed her eyes, and this time the words flowed out. And her sister asked, again, tell it again and again. She told that story to her sister all night long. And when the sun shone through the window in the morning, there were the two sisters sitting together with a stone, silver. For stories are meant to be shared. Thank you for letting me tell.